Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today has been described as one of the leading lights of modern India. He's a distinguished economist and academic who was chief editor of the Financial Express. He's written widely and extensively on issues related to India's economy, the global economy. He was also a member of the National Security Advisory Board and has served in numerous bodies and organizations across India and internationally. He's the spokesperson and the advisor, the media advisor to the Prime Minister of India. But he's really here in his sort of most current, recent incarnation as the author of The Strategic Consequences of India's Economic Performance, a book which has been widely acclaimed in India and internationally. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Sanjaya Baru.
Thank you.
One of the sort of key ideas of the many ideas in the book, and they are based on your writings before you became media advisor and spokesperson to the Prime Minister, span a large period of time. But to me it came out was the idea of looking at the issues of national security and linking them to the idea of the economic well-being of a nation, and more importantly, the notion of the interdependence of economies, and in the sense that our national security is best served the more interdependencies we're able to establish with other countries. Give us an illustration of India's, say, recent, well, I was going to say rapprochement with the United States, and how that manifests itself. Give us a kind of economics 101.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the essence of my argument. I mean, I was brought up as a student of economics in the 60s and 70s with the worldview at that time that the less you are dependent on the world, the more secure you are. And that was the basis of much of our economic policy in that period. We tried to cut ourselves away from the rest of the world. I think what we realized in the 80s was that there was a different way of doing this. And I think the one country that really did this on its own and showed the world the benefits of interdependence rather than cutting yourself off was China. It increased its interdependence with the outside world in the 80s. And thereby actually strengthened itself.
You've also written as to how skillfully they went about this.
That's right.
Right from reassuring the United States about their their trade deficit and what would happen with their U.S. dollars.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I think basically what my inspiration was from that experience, and I was looking at our own relationship with not just the United States but the world as a whole, including our own region with, say, Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Nepal, that we need to increase our relations, economic interaction, trade, investment flows, people flows, idea flows, and that these would become the basis of a stronger relationship and also basis of a greater security for us. And I think, if you look at the world today, it's an interdependent world. I mean, we talk about globalization. Globalization is not a one-way street. It really creates interdependencies on both sides. Other countries become dependent on us. And you talked specifically about the United States. I would also add China. These are two countries with which our interdependence has increased in the last 10 years. We do much more business with both countries. And as a result, I think there's a much more stable relationship now with both these countries.
You've also written, and you've quoted and said that even though Keynes has been sort of somewhat forgotten, but this whole issue of creating perceptions and how skillfully China has created very positive perceptions, despite the fact that they are predominantly politically a dictatorship and not really in tune with the values that everyday America might sort of seek to celebrate. And yet, because of the manner in which they have played this out, you've suggested that you're probably safer in China from attacks of terrorism than you are in most other places. What are some of the things that India is doing or can do in this regard to cultivate the sense of interdependence with China and with the United States, two partners that you mentioned?
Well, I think certainly we need to be much more open, across the board, not just trade, but also investment, but people flows. connectivities, air connectivity for instance. We hardly have any air connectivity with say China. Very few airlines. I think if you see more and more people traveling between countries, that creates much greater awareness between societies, and that also contributes to much closer relationship between societies. I'm glad you mentioned Keynes in that context. I think one of the important ideas in economics in the 20th century was the idea of expectations. And Keynes basically showed us how expectations do tend to get realized. I think what China did was to create positive expectations internationally about itself. People expect China to do well. People expect China to be a bigger market than it is. And those positive expectations for China actually got reinforced by experience. I think this is the challenge for India, not just with our own neighborhood, but also with the rest of the world. We need to create these positive expectations so that people expect that India would be a better partner, that India would be a more profitable partner, that that there is something to look out for. The future is with India. Those expectations are extremely important, both to generate and then to manage.
What are some of the mechanisms and strategies and the kinds of things that we should be saying and doing? I mean, I alluded to a few that China did. I mean, just the fact of, again, you've written this, the fact of hosting the Olympics sends out a signal. Restraint on what they do with the US dollars that they have stashed up sends out a signal. What are the kind of things that we might be doing?
Well, I think one area in which we are doing something fairly productively and successfully is in projecting our strengths in the knowledge economy. I think people have come to recognize that India has certain skills and capabilities which are unique to India. This has been a tremendous change in our image. I mean, I remember going to Shanghai in 1999 or 2000, and I was walking down the street. In fact, one of the essays in the columns in the book refers to that. And there was this young man who came and started talking to me. He wanted to know, first of all, whether I was from India. He said, "Are you Hindu?" So I said, "Yes." And then he said to me, "Are you IT?" I said, "No, I'm not IT. I'm a journalist." And he said, "Can I speak English?" And he spent the next 1 hour walking with me on the streets of Shanghai because he wanted to practice his English with me. But his image of India was that of an IT country. I mean, when he said, "Are you Hindu?" and then he said, "Are you IT?" I think that has made a huge difference for India in the last 5 years, globally. I mean, whether you go to New Zealand or you go to China or you go to Africa or anywhere else in the world, I think the fact that people now look at Indians, particularly young Indians, middle-class Indians, as intellectually creative, mentally creative, and therefore also economically productive, has certainly changed perceptions.
What about being on top of the corruption index and being the most bribable people in the world?
I think there are a lot of downsides. I mean, corruption is only one of them. I mean, if you look at India, there are as many downsides as there are upsides. I think there is this famous statement made about India, that every statement you make about India and its opposite is true. And therefore, I mean, I do believe that for everything good we do, there are a lot of negatives. But corruption, as Mrs. Indira Gandhi said many years ago, is a global phenomenon. I think ultimately we have to ask ourselves, what does it yield for the people? I mean, you look at many East Asian countries, there's a lot of corruption, but they are able to deliver development.
You're watching a conversation with Dr. Sanjaya Baru, author, economist, and currently media advisor and spokesperson for the Prime Minister. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Dr. Sanjaya Baru. The other sort of exploration in your book is the imperative, sort of the lessons learned from globalization and the imperative to create internal demand, local markets, and to develop the Indian consumer and the failure of many Southeast Asian countries to do that. In that process, there is a great deal of concern and fear about inequities, economic inequities. The government has been putting in huge sums of money looking at rural infrastructure and to expand that base of of consumers and the needs of the disadvantaged and the disfranchised. That's you know, when you read between the lines and writings in China, even about China, that still remains a very serious concern. That, you know, all the gloss of what's happening in the special economic zones, which we're struggling about too. But when you scratch the surface and you go beneath that, there is a real issue. How concerned are you about that dimension, and how confident are you about our ability to be able to substantially address those issues? And the economic data can be variably interpreted, but there is, you know, recent data suggests that, you know, even while the economy is growing, you know, the gaps are growing larger. Are you concerned? What can be done about it?
No, I do think there is an area of concern in terms of gaps. I mean, not just gaps between groups of people, gaps between regions, and there is an egalitarian process of development. And I think certainly that is one of the major concerns of even the current government. But, you know, inequality is again a global phenomenon. I mean, frankly, large continental economies develop unevenly. I don't think there's any country in the world where you had even development across the board, both socially as well as, you know, in terms of geographical space. So that there is inequality in China, there is inequality in India, there is inequality in Brazil, there is inequality in South Africa, there is inequality in the United States. But question really is, one, what is the direction? You know, are you moving towards a more equal society? Are you, and more importantly, are you doing enough to build the foundations for a more equal society? I think that is the real challenge. And I think there is now a greater realization that we need to do more of that in order to deal with the problems of inequality.
Is that something that is substantially happening? You know, the famous thing of Rajiv Gandhi, that, you know, only a small percentage, 15% or 20% of the money that you will put into rural infrastructure and the rural employment guarantee scheme is going to actually get to anybody. And there are huge amounts of money being allocated there really to garner votes. And how significantly is that going to impact? And obviously you've been a media person, we'll come to your experience with the media later, but you know, reports and television images of farmers' suicides and the extreme manifestations of poverty and deprivation juxtaposed with the more affluent images on television. You know, I think amongst the sort of more sensitive, the socially conscious, the socially sensitive, raises deep anguish and deep concern.
Well, you know, this is one of the central arguments of my book, which is that for India to become a major power or a great nation, we need to address this. That the only way in which India can realize its destiny, and I do believe that our destiny is to once again recover that space in the global system. India, as you remember, like China and Europe, shared 1/3 of the world economy 300 years ago in the 1700s. So I do believe that addressing these challenges is critical to our realizing this lost kind of space. But the difference between the period when someone like Mr. Rajiv Gandhi worried about the waste of resources in these kinds of programs for reducing inequality, and today, is that you have a much more vibrant media. I think the analogy of 15%, etc., no longer holds true. I do believe that today the media focuses much more on what is happening on the ground. And with something like the Right to Information Act, you have, you know, empowered even civil society. So I actually think that today there's much less wastage in the system, that monies allocated are there available for development. I think the real concern is often we don't spend that money. I mean, I once wrote a column in the Financial Express looking at rural development, that over a 5-year period, I found that every year we were actually spending less than what was being allocated in the budget. And the reason being that the system is unable to absorb. You know. In the last 2 years, there's been an enormous increase in spending for education and health. I'm not sure how much of that has actually been spent. I think those are governance issues of the ability of local governments, state governments to go and spend that money, provide those services. Those are the real issues we have to worry about.
No, I've often wondered why in a country like India with a vibrant media, elections, a vibrant democracy, issues such as education, public health, roads, sanitation, don't really become specific and significant issues in elections. How much of an inhibitor, a deterrent, do you think that is towards the achievement of the kind of economic goals and aspirations that we're talking about? Because there isn't that kind of specific demand pull, shall we say, particularly in the ballot box, through the ballot box.
Well, not entirely, Rajiv. I think, it's true that in India we don't focus on specific issues of policy. For instance, I want a better hospital in my constituency, otherwise I will not vote for you. That doesn't become an issue at a constituency level. But I think one of the things that most of our election analysis show is that election after election in the last 15, 20 years, economic issues do tend to become the dominant issues. Yogendra Yadav's surveys, opinion surveys, do show, and what people kind of loosely refer to as anti-incumbency, which I once described in a column in May 2004, describing the results of that election, and before I joined the government, as the revolution of rising expectations. And I find this morning in one of the papers, Jagdish Bhagwati, the economist, also talking about the revolution of rising expectations. I think what is revolution of rising expectations? People expect more and more and more. And when they don't get what they expect, they vote out the government. So this so-called anti-incumbency, because of which governments are getting voted out again and again, is really not because nothing is happening, but that the expectation of people is rising. They want a better quality of life. They want all these things which you mentioned. And since they are not able to get it enough or in time, they vote out the government.
There is this sort of a perception that issues of caste, of community, and other than economic imperatives and economic demands, seem to play such a dominant role in the political discourse in India, and it isn't really reflective of the modern, vibrant democracy of cultivating an economic system and growing to be a major economic power. It just sort of the chicken and the egg. Is it that when we sort of get
sorry to
no, I was just saying, no, when we get to that stage of economic development, these things will recede.
No, even in the most modern of democracies, ethnic loyalties, social loyalties, caste loyalties, or they don't use the word caste, but racial loyalties, make a difference. I mean, in the US, for instance, you'll ask, where will the black vote go? Where will the Jewish vote go? Where will the Irish vote go? Where will the Latin vote go? And similarly in other democracies. I mean, I remember I was surprised when I went to South Korea to discover how much regional and ethnic loyalties are so important in their elections. So I think across the world there are all these loyalties. In India it is caste. In some other country it may be something else. But I think human beings, we have centuries of memory in our mind. We are not just our mind doesn't carry only our experience from last 30 years, 40 years. It carries experience of last 3,000 years.
You're watching a conversation with Dr. Sanjaya Baru, author, economist, and currently media advisor and spokesperson for the Prime Minister. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Dr. Sanjaya Baru. You worked with the Times of India, you worked with the Financial Express, you were chief editor, you've been an anchor of television, you've had extensive experience in the media, you sort of are, in a sense, the bridge for the Prime Minister as his media advisor. There is a great deal of concern and anguish in the manner in which many areas of the media are emerging. That the role of globalization has meant that local agendas are addressed internationally. It meant that sort of large business houses are controlling huge media interests, and the old romantic notion of the independent editor articulating the concerns and passions and anxieties and needs of civil society is being diluted. What do you think?
Well, the editor, the editor certainly is an endangered species. I mean, I really worry for Indian journalism that I think like the editor is the fulcrum of an organization. I cannot conceive of a media organization without an editor. It is like conceiving of a country without a prime minister. You know, I mean, how can you conceive that? It is like conceiving of a family without a head. You know, you need a nucleus around which things gravitate. And I think I think that one of the negative things we've had in Indian media is the dilution of the role of the editor. But I see some signs of revival. I see, for instance, recently some news organizations investing much more in their editorial capabilities, which is a good sign. I think there is a discovery that you need to have leadership, qualitative leadership. But more than that, Rajiv, what worries me is the mad competition, mad scramble for news. I think in this, hopefully it's a phase. Hopefully we'll settle down to a much more stable system. But in the last 2 years in this job, I've seen a phase of excessive competition. I mean, so much so that if somebody gets news a minute or half a minute before another person, he says, "Thank you very much, my career has been made." And as if the heavens have fallen.
What about the blurring of the lines between news and advertising? Again, that we grew up, akhbar mein padha hai, my parents told me that sach hoga, or if you've seen something on television, you saw it on television, it must be real. That really isn't the case anymore. What happens to sort of our romanticized notions of media and democracy? Where do we get our information? Where do we get our competing points of view from different interests that might manifest in different media?
Well, I think first of all, the plurality of the media ensures competition. The very fact that we have so many newspapers, so many TV channels, that in itself, I mean, numbers actually make a difference. So I'm delighted that we have such large numbers. Having said that, I have problem dealing with competition. But I think the relationship between advertising or commercial interests and editorial interests has been there all along. I mean, you go back 100 years and you look at news organizations. I don't think it's true that in the past they were not there. What is the difference? The difference is the role of the editor. I mean, if you have a strong editorial control over a newspaper or news organization, then you are able to balance these various interests. If you don't have that control, then things tend to go haywire. So I come back to the same point, that I think we need good editors in order to ensure that news organizations remain loyal to their basic purpose.
What about some of these attempts to legislate one's way out of some of these problems and predicaments about cross-media holding, foreign investment in the Indian media? How do you react to that? Do you think those are sort of legitimate devices and approaches to address these issues? Or how do we begin to do that, other than sort of discussing it and trying to create the pressure of public opinion? What do we do?
No, I think pressure of public opinion certainly is a relevant and legitimate way of addressing policy.
But is that likely to be enough? Do you welcome a legislative option or a law in that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately public opinion in a democracy has to manifest itself through law. I mean, you need some framework of rules and procedures for that public opinion to then become official policy.
It's an ideal, very sort of mythical kind of democracy. It doesn't really happen in
even in our kind of democracy. I mean, ultimately, you start with an idea. That idea then gains currency. And once it has gained currency, a government is required to create policies.
That's what you'd say if you were teaching a class in political science.
That's how it happens. You look at the media policy. You go back, actually it is Dr. Manohar Singh, who first time, I remember, I think in the early 90s, 92 or so, while he was talking to the Foreign Correspondents Club, and I was in the audience at that time, mentioned the fact that we need to take a fresh look at foreign investment in media. We are now in 2006. Government policy has come a long way since then. But I think government policy has lagged behind public opinion. Public opinion has in fact shaped policy. So I do think that in many other areas, public opinion in this country does shape policy. And that is where media plays a very important role.
I'm not sort of suggesting that it's completely divorced. But I think the time lag, sometimes the subtleties, the ability of particularly the media to lobby in its own interests.
There are lobbies all
is,
across.
Is very persuasive. I mean,
True.
look at the struggle with the broadcasting bill, to the sort of attempting a grandstand on behalf of public broadcasting. I think look at the passionate opposition to that from commercially driven media.
No, but lobbying is a legitimate part of a democracy.
Oh, and there's not a case against lobbying. I'm really making a case and saying that sometimes the lobbying abilities of in a democracy vary between different commercial and economic
and the better,
and their ability, and some of them are more effective.
More successful
than
lobbies
others.
make it.
You were talking about sitting in the audience and listening to Manmohan Singh, and I was reading on the internet your column when one weekend the call came to join the Prime Minister's office and give up being an active editor. What prompted you? What motivated you at that time? I mean, here you're hands-on. You can say and do what you want, and you have got into sort of the the little bit of sort of the occasional how do I put it, misstep. As the spokesperson, skirmish on the media, to give up that freedom and join the establishment.
First of all, I've done a lot of things impulsively in life. Becoming a journalist was one of them. I was teaching for 10 years and one fine day decided to give up teaching and get into journalism. So this was another similar move. I gave up journalism to get into government. But I think the motivating factor was the opportunity to work with someone like Dr. Manmohan Singh. I mean, after Nehru, we haven't really had a scholar prime minister. And I don't think for a long, long time we'll have another one. So it's a rare opportunity to...
If it's not giving out, trade secrets, what does a media advisor do? I mean, a spokesperson's role is fairly clear. What are the kinds of things that you do? Do you write sort of some of his, Galbraith's, speeches for Kennedy? Are you sort of doing some of that kind of work?
I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, if you like. Man about town as for the Prime Minister, try to do a little bit of this and that, and keep him abreast of what's happening in the media. I think, as I said, in a democracy, the media is a mirror to society. So keeping abreast of the media helps you keep abreast of society. And you need to do that. I think that is really the hallmark of a good, active, functioning democracy, that you track the media, because in a sense it is a mirror to society.
So what's the next impulse? I know you can't anticipate an impulse. It's a it's a 3-year appointment, and maybe it'll run longer. But what
no, it's not a 3-year appointment. It's at the whim and fancy of my boss. I can be out tomorrow. I can be there for a long time.
Well, we'll try and make sure that there's no skirmish as a result of this program. But what kind of you're still sort of in your early 50s. You've had a very distinguished career as an academic, as an editor, worked in government. Do you dream dreams?
Oh yes, I think that I do, certainly do.
So what's the favorite one?
Well, I keep telling my wife that I'd like to set up a dosa shop and make dosas the whole day. Maybe I should take into fast food or something like that. I love cooking, so maybe that's what I'll end up doing.
Who knows? Maybe a cooking program, a cooking magazine, and to become sort of. Well, we have distinguished editors who write about food, so maybe that will unfold. Thank you very much, Sanjay. This has been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Lovely.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You're wonderful.
Thanks.